Hello, welcome to the Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. I'm Natalia Shpulova-Said, and joining me today is Anya Abramyan. We're delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Oksana Yurkova, with a presentation on academic Januses, GPU-NKVD, secret informants at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, 1920s, 1930s. Dr. Oksana Yurkova is a leading researcher at the Institute of History of Ukraine, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine in Kyiv. Her research interests include historiography of the 20th century with a focus on the interwar period, the Ukrainian historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky and his Kyiv Historical School, iconography, anthropology of academic life, electronic information resources. In 2015, Dr. Yurkova initiated the Mikhailo Hrushevsky Digital Archives, which collects and presents all printed and archival materials dealing with this famous historian and political figure. So we will start with Dr. Yurkova's lecture. Please submit your comments and questions via the Q&A option, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. Oksana Yurkova will address those during our Q&A session. Welcome, Oksana.
Dear Natalia, thank you very much for the opening presentation speech. And I would like to share my presentation. Just a moment. Well, dear colleagues, today I want to present the preliminary results of my continuing research on the very complicated theme. This is why it's necessary to make some introducing remarks and say some words about definitions. I will speak about people who were secret informers or secret collaborators. In English, it's rather difficult to give the one proper definition to the people whom we identify as секретные сотрудники in Russian, секретні співробітники in Ukrainian, or as we customarily say in the form of Russian abbreviation, SEXOS. In the documents, you can also find one more abbreviation, just two letters S with a slash between them. Informers or SEXOS were people who secretly agreed to collaborate with the Soviet secret police. Of course, they were out of staff. From 1917 to 1991, this secret police changed its name a few times from ЧК to KGB. But basically, it was the same authority closely associated with the Communist Party. As far as my talk covers interwar period, I will speak about GPU and its successors since 1934 NKVD. I want to stress that there were two types of SEXOS: informants, осведомители in Russian, and agents, агенты. Persons who voluntarily or forcibly accepted direct invitations for secret cooperation with the GPU-NKVD were agents. Instead, informants were those who secretly, also voluntarily or under duress, provided the secret police with the data and materials they needed, but the GPU-NKVD did not officially cooperate with these individuals. Informants who constantly carried out the instructions of the GPU-NKVD would become agents for some time. As for the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, it was established in 1918 by Hetman Pavlo Skoropadsky as a state scientific institution. The Academy managed to survive despite numerous changes of different regimes in Ukraine in 1918-1920. In the 20s, its development became fast-growing both in quantitative and qualitative senses. In spite of small budget, the Academy organized various scientific institutions. Many journals and monographs were published. In the 1920s, the great step forward was made in the historical studies because of academician Hrushevsky activity. The Bolsheviks, on their side, needed to control everything to prevent and neutralize real or potential threats to the Soviet state. So already in the early 1920s, the system of permanent surveillance of the country's population was established. The control was largely carried out through an extensive network of informers. The presence of the informers who were virtually everywhere has never been a secret for the Soviet people. But who were these people? The informers or sexots were staff members of different institutions and organizations. Sometimes they were unemployed, or were housewives, or workers, or students, or even party functionaries. But their activity as informants or agents was absolutely secret. How did informers or sexots act? Just imagine, you are in the Soviet Union and you meet your friends and you discuss some issues of your business. No politics, just small talks. Or you have a party and among other things, in between drinks and dances, you complain about high prices and your small salary, or you speak about your friends and neighbors and so on and so forth. Or we have a meeting and I speak at a meeting. You give comments and questions, and then after the meeting, you discuss my talk. Ordinary situation, aren't they? Yes, of course, ordinary. But at the same time, there are few sexots about the participants of all these talks. And after these events, they will write detailed reports to the secret police, or they will meet secret police officers, and these officers will record informers' oral reports. For instance, if this lecture was offline, one or two of my listeners could be informers. In their secret reports to the GPU-NKVD, they would describe activity of the lecturer and audience, mood, political views, plans, and especially in the late 1920s and in the 1930s, they can easily accuse lecturer or discussants of counter-revolutionary views and bourgeois nationalistic activities. Also, all of us were faithful Bolsheviks and support all party initiatives. Of course, I can also be an informer, and I can also write a report with the same accusations because I don't like your questions. For instance, or you're my competitor, or who knows why I don't like you. Maybe your housing conditions are better than mine, and I want to live in your room. One more very important detail. The informers had to report at regular intervals. As a result, after a time, the GPU-NKVD have enough documents about your and my so-called counter-revolutionary activity, and finally you or me are arrested and sentenced to exile or even to death. And now I want to show you one photo. I discovered it in 2015 in the archive of the Shevchenko Scientific Society in New York. The photo was taken in Kiev in late October 1926 when academician Mikhail Hrushevsky celebrated his 60th anniversary. You can see Hrushevsky himself in the center and 23 persons around him. We know their names. Among these 23 persons, we can find reputable researchers beginners, and graduate students. They all worked at the academic historical institutions organized by Hrushevsky and under his supervision. Of course, not all researchers who worked with Hrushevsky are pictured, but it's a jubilee, and this photo is taken in the main office of the historical institutions in Kiev at that time. To make long story short, I give you only summarized figures about these people on the photo. 13 historians out of 24, including Grushevsky himself, were repressed. One of these 13 was shot, 6 died in labor camps. Grushevsky died during his so-called honorary exile. 4 persons were forced to move from Ukraine to Russia. In such a way, they saved their lives. At least 2 persons emigrated during World War II. We have no information about the fates of 3 persons. But in general, it's a very sad picture. So at this jubilee photo, we see 19 men and 5 women. Can you guess how many sex sorts are there? And now I will easily impress you. I have the documental proofs that 4 persons at this photo were sex sorts. 6 other persons are on my suspicious list. I suppose that they could report to the GPU-NKVD, but now I have only indirect evidences. So in general, 10 persons out of 23 ones from the very close Grushevsky's academic milieu reported to the GPU-NKVD. It's necessary to say that such situation was not unique. The same situation with sex sorts was at other academic institutions. All informers had their nicknames or code names. And when somebody speaks about sex sorts, the main question is about the decoding of informers' names. Have you ever seen the German film The Lives of Others? It won the Oscar for the best foreign language film in 2006. I will tell you the plot just in few sentences without details. The story was going on in East Germany in the early 1980s. The Stasi officer was ordered to spy on the playwright. Some dramatic events happened, but at the end, this Stasi officer helped the playwright to avoid imprisonment. When the Berlin Wall fell down, the playwright discovered that last 20 years he was under surveillance. The Stasi record agency became open and the playwright visited it and ordered his file. He was greatly surprised because of the quantity of his files. When he reviewed his files, he discovered the code name of the Stasi officer in charge of his surveillance. And guess what did he do? He just asked the archival worker to look through the catalog, and due to this data file, he found out the real name of the Stasi officer. Very easy, isn't it? Yes. But not in our case. In Ukraine, we have opposite situation. So forget everything I have told you before. And basically, in Ukraine, the names of sex sorts have not been officially disclosed yet, despite the fact that the USSR, the state that required secret reporting, has not existed for almost 3 decades. The reason is quite simple. Just before Ukraine gained the independence, many KGB archival files were either obliterated or moved to Russia. Main data informers files were also either obliterated or moved to Russia. But how can we speak about informers if data files are absent? I argue that we can make a research because we have other documents which contain the information we need. Of course, this research demands scrupulous and long work, but we can do it. I need to make one more digression to explain this phenomenon. In 3 years after Ukraine gained the independence, the State Archive of the Security Service of Ukraine was created. It was in 1994. Also, as I stressed earlier, many files were obliterated or moved to Moscow. Many files still remain in Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. The archival funds of the ČK, GPU-NKVD, KGB, mainly the archival and criminal cases of rehabilitated victims of political repressions in Ukraine, became partly accessible to researchers. For instance, my first visit to the SBU archive was in the mid-1990s, but at the time, as a historian without any privilege and without special access to the secret documents, I could work only with files of rehabilitated persons. Moreover, some pages of these files were pinned together and no digital copies were allowed. I made handwritten notes. Sometimes it was funny to find out that a document which was inaccessible in one file, you could find opened in other files, so you can study the document. It was because of secret police paperwork. Many records of interrogations and other documents were usually typed in many copies, and these copies were included in many criminal files as evidences of guilt. At the same time, the staff workers of the SBU archive and few researchers were able to work with the regulatory and administrative documents and documents of unclassified and secret record keeping. For instance, in 1996, historian Yuri Shapoval and the then deputy head of the SBU, now late Volodymyr Pristaiko, published the collection of documents from the many-volume Mikhailo Hrushevsky surveillance file, in Russian Delo Formular. But despite my repeated requests to let me get acquainted with these archival documents, as a specialist in Hrushevsky's life and activity, I was repeatedly declined. Nevertheless, the publication of this book was a real success. Among 124 published documents, there were 22 Informants reports, and it was for the first time that these reports were openly published. Also, the headings of these documents were somewhat shamelessly labeled as information about Hrushevsky, and the code names of the informers were also omitted. You can compare the page of the book with the original document. And my research on sex thoughts and the activities became possible since 2015. It was that year that the documentation laws in Ukraine gave open access to the GPU, NKVD, and KGB archives and all documents. I began to study almost unknown dela formulari, surveillance files, on the Ukrainian scholars who worked at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in the 1920s, 1930s. And now the question, when did these files appear and what do they look like? It's necessary to go back to 1922. In November 1922, the head of the GPU secret department, Menzhinsky, sent a secret circular on the anti-Soviet movement among the intelligentsia. This letter reiterated, sometimes even literally, and developed the thesis of the resolution on anti-Soviet parties and trends, adopted in August 1922 by the 20th All-Russian Communist Party Conference. Actually, this GPU letter was a logical extension of party decision. The main task of the GPU was to fight against the counter-revolution and to establish the total control over qualified intellectuals. GPU should take the control over the high schools with all professors, teachers, students, publishing houses with publishers, writers, editors, trade unions and associations, cooperative societies, and conferences, congresses, meetings. First, attention was paid to the creation of informers networks in all these institutions, organizations, and associations. Informers should be not necessarily party members, but politically advanced people. They were obliged to cover a number of issues, political movements, all non-political, non-official groups, illegal organizations and associations, political phases of activists, their attitude to different events. They should record all cases of counter-revolutionary propaganda as well as all international contacts. The secular required to set up personal file cases, surveillance files on all professors, politically active students, writers, publicists, doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, artists. These files were supposed to accumulate documents on above-mentioned persons. Besides personal files, each institution had its own file, which involved the general materials provided by the informers and characteristics of persons who worked or studied there. The secular was immediately implemented. A powerful network of secret informers was created in Ukraine. The figures that indicate the numbers of sex sorts are striking. We have data that, for example, in 1927, more than 700 persons were recruited as informers. And in 1928, more than 1,400 new sex sorts started their work. 1,400 new sex sorts only in 1 year. Of course, not all of them were involved in the supervision of the academics, but the figure strongly suggests that many researchers at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences were secret agents. At the moment, I get acquainted with the 8 surveillance files on Ukrainian scholars who worked at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, 9 files. I should say that since 2015, each year I made a few inquiries and in total asked for more than 6 dozen academics who worked at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences at that time. Due to my persistence, I received few files which were inaccessible before. I hope that the SBU archive will finish its catalog in the near future and we will have more material for analysis. On the whole, I studied 10 volumes of surveillance file on academician Mikhail Grushevsky, 1 volume of his brother, historian and specialist in study of literature Alexander Grushevsky, volumes on Petro Kurinyy, historian Pavlo Gradkivsky, volume on historian Fedor Savchenko, who was Grushevsky's personal assistant, historian Mykola Levchenko, who was academician Krymsky personal assistant, 6 volumes on historian Kost Stepa, 2 volumes on historian Kost Guslista, and 2 volumes of collective file under the title Runaways, Беглецы, Втекачи. And a few words about this very interesting file, Runaways. It contains documents on persons who understood that if they wanted to rescue their lives, they should run somewhere from Ukraine, to Russia, to the North Caucasus, to Central Asia. All places beyond Ukrainian borders looked more secure than Ukraine. And those persons who realized their plans survived, and those who failed were arrested and repressed. And among them, for instance, very famous Ukrainian writers Boris Antonenko Davidovich and Grigory Kosynko. As far as it's impossible to give full description of all these files, I will concentrate on their characteristic features on the basic of few files, mainly on Mikhailo Grushevsky and Alexander Grushevsky. Basically, all these files include the same types of documents. The earliest surveillance file I have acquainted with was opened in Kiev on Professor Alexander Grushevsky. If we compare the dates, we will see that the file on Professor Alexander Grushevsky was opened on September the 29th, 1923, and its original number was 158. The GPU circular, as you remember, was issued in November 1922. So we have more than 150 files opened by Kiev GPU department during 9 months after the circular. The file on academician Mikhailo Grushevsky was opened on March the 20th, 1924, just in 2 weeks after Grushevsky returned home from emigration. And its original number was 1023. So from September 1923 to March 1924, that is 6 months, the Kiev GPU department opened almost 900 files. And it's great paperwork, isn't it? All these files have few cardboard bindings and few archival numbers on these bindings. The documents are put in non-chronological order mainly, and pages have double or even triple page numbering. For instance, this page from Alexander Grushevsky file at the beginning had number 43. Then it was changed to 37, and its current number is 9. So you can imagine that many documents were removed or replaced, and as far as we do not have the inventory of documents, we can't clarify the missing documents. Nevertheless, we have 4 main types of documents. The first type we can call in GPU-NKVD documents. Among them, we can find decisions on surveillance over academics. Here is the GPU resolution on launching a file over Alexander Grushevsky. Grushevsky, who was accused in Petlyurovщина and Ukrainian chauvinism. Then different intelligence tasks. This is an intelligence task on Alexander Grushevsky from September 1923. The GPU-NKVD agents reports about the results of the external surveillance. Sometimes they are very funny, by the way. Also, we have in GPU-NKVD correspondence and GPU-NKVD reports and memorials. These documents also have information about sex assaults. Almost all of these documents are typewritten, and we have both originals and copies certified by the authorized persons. The second type of documents consists of perlustrated correspondence. Sometimes we have original letters which were withdrawn and the addressees did not receive them at all. But usually we have typewritten copies, as you see. These copies are of great value because in many cases the correspondence between academics was lost because of repressions, wars, and fear. We know examples that academics or their relatives burnt down whole archives because they were afraid of possible repressions. And now, due to these files, we have some letters. Then we have press clippings, both original and typewritten. They were removed from the perlustrated correspondence. By the way, I suppose that Grushevsky and others were aware of that fact that their correspondence was perlustrated, and they began to send postcards and not the letters in envelopes to hasten the GPU-NKVD work. The third type of documents are the copies of journals and minutes of meetings. They were typewritten in many copies, and then they were fragmented into small pieces. There was no need to put the whole journal or minute or the whole sheet of paper into the file, and it was enough of small pieces with the name of a person under surveillance. And at last, the informers' reports form the first type of documents. In most cases, these reports were typewritten and certified by the GPU-NKVD officers. The handwritten originals of these reports were included into the personnel agents' files. Then these reports were typewritten in many copies and enclosed to many surveillance files. Moreover, in one file you can find few extracts from one report made by fixed sex sort on a certain day, and in other file you can find other extracts. The GPU-NKVD paperwork was to some extent frugal. Unfortunately, most of the personnel agents' files with their handwritten reports were obliterated or moved to Russia. During my more than 20-year work with the GPU-NKVD documents, I made this file only once, and it contained just 8 pages with application form, execution order, and rehabilitation order, which stated that a person was a sex sort. All the original reports were obliterated. And I want to stress that each surveillance file have different quantity of these informers reports. For instance, in Mikhailo Grushevsky file, that is 10 volumes, more than 3,300 pages, we have 25% of the informers reports. In Alexander Grushevsky file, more than 60% of informers reports. Of course, I counted only those documents which have been saved. And now my favorite picture. This is the full list of sex sorts whose reports we can find in volumes of Grushevsky file. At least 107 sex sorts reported on Grushevsky in 1924-1931. Here you can see their nicknames. Some of them are very impressive. Академик, незаможник, европеец, литератор, математик, турбогенератор. Pay attention that usually all names in the GPU-NKVD KGB typewritten texts are in capital letters. The code names or nicknames or pseudonyms of sex sorts usually appear in quotation marks. So if you see Tichina in quotation marks, you should understand that this sex sort was not Pavlo Tichina himself, but maybe somebody who was close to Tichina. We can also mark how many sex sorts reported to Grushevsky on years. In 1924, we fixed only 4 sex sorts. In 1925, 8. In 1926, 29. In 1927, 18. In 1928, 40, and so on. And if we count reports, we will have other figures. We see a rapid increase in the number of reports on Mikhailo Grushevsky from 7 in 1924 to 88 in 1926, which after a slight decrease in 1927 increased to 103 in 1928. and then they rose up to 100 reports in 1930. Such peaks are understandable. In 1926, Grushevsky celebrated his anniversary, and GPU kept everything under control. In 1928, the Soviet authorities reformed the Academy of Sciences, so the GPU needed detailed information on Academy. In 1929, the violent Sovietization of the Academy continued, and mass arrests began in falsified case of the SVU, Спілка визволення України, Union of Liberation of Ukraine. In 1931, Grushevsky moved to Moscow, and practically we have no documents about his Moscow life. But there is no doubt that he was under surveillance. Hope that one day this Moscow file will also be acceptable. And finally, I want to present you a few sexots who worked at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in the late 1920s, 1930s. I will start with sexot whose nickname, academic, is very expressive. Informant academic began his activity in December 1926 and finished in May 1929. I discovered 54 typewritten reports based on information given by academic to the GPU officers. He described the life of the All-Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, mainly around academic Agatan Krymsky, who was one of the founders of the Academy and its academic secretary in 1918-1928. In fact, Krymsky was the second, after the president, person at the Academy of Sciences for 10 years. I managed to disclose the nickname of sexot. His real name was Mykola Levchenko. This young scholar became Krymsky's personal assistant since early 1920s. Krymsky gave absolute credence to him and even adopted Levchenko. Meanwhile, sexot academic reported about academician Krymsky and the academy to the GPU. In fact, the GPU officers cynically used a young man who was very inexperienced. They managed to convince Levchenko that he was just a consultant in academic affairs, but not a secret agent. Levchenko's fate was tragic. He was arrested in 1929 and sentenced to 10 years of labor camps. In 1934, he was discharged, but after his return to Kiev, he committed suicide. He hanged himself. The circumstances of his death have not been fully clarified. The burial place is unknown. And seems that Mykola Levchenko understood his role as a so-called GPU academic consultant. And one more, sexot was a real agent. He was very active. He wrote very detailed and numerous reports on many pages. For instance, only in 2 years, 1929-1930, he wrote 29 reports on Mikhailo Grushevsky. He changed his name a few times and often used nicknames. Kost Stepa is known as a historian of the Byzantium Empire, the Orthodox Church, late medieval history of Ukraine, and, surprise, the history of Stalin's purge. You should definitely know his works, Russian Purge and the Extraction of Confession, written under nickname Godin in co-authorship with Friedrich Gautermans. And Russian Historians and the Soviet State, published in 1962 after Stepa's death. He died in 1958. Also, he was accused in cooperation with the Nazis during World War II, and then after his immigration to the USA, he probably worked with the Central Intelligence Agency. Or maybe he was a secret agent in the CIA, who knows. Anyway, although his life is full of mysteries, we know exactly. He was a sex sort, and we have numerous documental proofs. For instance, here you can see a page from Stepa's criminal file. He was arrested in 1938 and then released in few months. That he began to report to the GPU-NKVD in 1928. Then there is a special chapter after the title The Sex Sort in his book Russian Purge and the Extraction of Confession. Also, the story is conducted on behalf of a third person who was the famous historian. According to the biographical data of the narrator, we can easily guess Stepa himself. Answering the question, who are the people who volunteer for such work, Stepa proposes to distinguish between two different kinds of sex sorts, the voluntary and the involuntary, but he portrays both types mercilessly. Then the narrator recounts the story of his mythical cellmate, the engineer Kovalenko, who believed in communism and decided to sell the party as a sex sort. Knowing Stepa's biography, we can assume that it was an autobiographical story, a preparation of his own experience. And in the end, it ended in Kovalenko's arrest. From the NKVD point of view, Kovalenko had outlived his usefulness. Such is the pitiless law of life, summed up Stepa. Did Stepa repent of what he had done? Well, who knows? And now I want to thank you for your attention and stress that as the KGB archives is accessible and it's very easy to collaborate with Ukrainian archivists, we can discover much more interesting things, and I'm sure we can disclose much more nicknames of sex sorts in our future. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. We can proceed to our Q&A session. Please submit your questions either in our chat box or in our Q&A box. And while we're waiting for our questions, I have my comment. Are there any plans to make this information available in English?
Sorry?
Are there any plans to make this information available in English to translate some of the documents? Because, well, I managed to read some of them and the information is just fascinating. And I'm thinking that it would be great if we could have this information available in English.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will think about it. Thank you.
I also noticed another thing which is connected with the language, that all the reports are in Russian. So it was a standard language for submitting reports. Did you have any reports which were written in Ukrainian, for example?
Yes, of course. Some of them were written in Ukraine, but mainly in Russian. Mm-hmm. Some reports, by the way, were written in Polish, and they have reports in German, but in English and French, but always they have translations in Russian. Mm-hmm. So both original text and translation.
And could you make a comment on that slide that you showed? It was written in Ukrainian, and I think it was written by Hrushevsky's wife or sister. I'm not sure the relation. And it was mentioned that, well, in English, it would be something like the mood is not great, or we have a lousy mood. In Ukrainian, it sounds like nastroy собачий. and it is underlined in red. Is it underlined by one of the agents or by one of the informants, or it was underlined afterwards? And if it is underlined, why that particular phrase appears underlined?
Thank you very much for your comment. You know that all underlines were made by NKVD or the GPU officers. Everything. These typewritten reports were Sexots did not see these typewritten reports, and all underlines were made by GPU officers, so they underlined names, names of organizations, so to spread these copies in different files. And sometimes they write, it's necessary to put attention to this man, or it's underline some interesting facts or phrases. And I studied different pencils and pens they used. Then the higher officer was, he used red pencil, and officer on lower position used blue pencil. It's very interesting to study even the color of these pencils.
So there is some hierarchy in the color.
Yes, it's a hierarchy.
Were those, well, as you mentioned, some informants were quite young, and one of them committed suicide. Were they given any instructions on what to look for? I'm sure they were given some instructions, but how to write those reports, what to pay attention, because again, one of the first slides that you showed, that report was also written in a very detailed manner. It specified what time Grushevsky left, what time he arrived, what he said. Of course, what he said during his lecture may seem to be important, but all other information, which is probably about his routine life, is also included in that report. So what are those instructions for beginners, let's say?
I did not found these instructions, but as they can see that they reported about all routine life and about details, about different discussions among academics, and about their talks between themselves and among themselves, and sometimes about scandals, and it's very funny to study this everyday academics' life through these reports of Sexots. And if we compare real documents and letters and these reports, we can admit that these reports are real. And it's one more source for the study of academic life in the 1920s.
Since you mentioned academic life, you started the presentation with showing a picture of the collective, right, of the whole community of the Institute of History, if I'm not mistaken. And you also noted that probably how many, 9 or 10 even
10% were Sexots, yeah.
Sexots, right. So do you think that it somehow influenced the atmosphere in that workplace, that they were aware of each other, and that knowing that somehow shaped the way they worked and communicated?
Thank you for this great question. Really, I paid attention that a few names of Sexots were known for Grushevsky and his closest milieu, and they tried to avoid speak in their with these persons, but they understood that they are good historians, and then it's necessary to continue their historical research. So it's they support them as historians, but avoid to communicate them in their everyday life, and sometimes it causes conflicts. and you know that it's not very easy to work with person who is sex thought and you know about his reports to the GPU.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really influenced the everyday life greatly, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, that's they really know that the GPU controlled them, and that's why they began to write not letters in envelopes but postcards. And it was the sign that they know about the surveillance, and they need to inform each other about their activity, and to hasten this communication, it's necessary to use not letters but postcards.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You also mentioned that in 1927 there were 700 recruited informants and agents. And I'm wondering if, on the one hand, I realize that maybe this question will be beyond your main expertise, but is there any information about informants at, let's say, institutional organizations or educational organizations in other former Soviet republics, not just Ukraine? And if there is that information, if the number of recruited informants was higher or lower?
I think that it's too hard for me to compare because we have no data. But because you know that in Russia and Belarus, this KGB archives are closed, and it's impossible even to know about the fates of repressed people sometimes. But I can say that in general the situation was the same, and the percentage of sex thoughts was alike in Ukraine, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You also mentioned that researchers and those who were working at educational institutions wanted to run away from Ukraine, and it looked like any other place is better than Ukraine. Would you elaborate on that?
Yes, it was impossible to live, to go to Poland or in Europe or to the United States, but it was impossible to go to Russia or to other Soviet republics, and in such a way they really saved their lives. I studied few cases, and it was a good way to escape from Ukraine. And it's funny, but in Russia, Ukrainian historians continue to study history of Ukraine. And moreover, they work in Academy of Sciences of Russia. They work in Russian archives, and they continue the same themes of Ukrainian history, but in Russia, they were not Ukrainian bourgeois nationalists. Mm-hmm. And in such a way, they saved their lives and survived during repression. It's a very interesting phenomena. And those who failed, who because of different situation, who failed, who stayed at home in Ukraine, many of them were repressed and died in labor camps or were shot.
Mm-hmm. And when they moved to Moscow or to Russia in general, did they have to, well, I suppose they would probably have to change the approach they would take to research the history of Ukraine, as Hrushevsky's approach was quite different from the approach that was imposed by the Soviet ideology.
One more phenomena, you can read easily Hrushevsky in Moscow, but you could not read Hrushevsky in Kiev. So it was easily in Moscow to study Ukrainian history and to cite Hrushevsky and to read his works, but it was absolutely impossible to read Hrushevsky since mid 1930s in Ukraine, except so-called special sectors of libraries, spetskhran. So,
and how would you explain that phenomenon?
It's you know that I understand that authority in Ukraine was afraid of so-called Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism, and it was not so sufficient in other republics than Ukraine. And maybe because of this roots of Ukrainian roots that could be found in Ukraine, it was necessary to close all possibilities for Ukrainian historians and Ukrainian people to read Hrushevsky and to study Hrushevsky in Ukraine itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Ani, do you have any other questions? Do we have questions?
Yes, thank you so much for a very fascinating presentation. I wanted to go back to the item that you mentioned, that in Russia and in Belarus, the KGB archives are closed, but in 2015 they were opened in Ukraine. What was the circumstance? Why is it that in Ukraine they became available?
Thank you for your question. You know that, the archive was opened in Ukraine in the mid-1990s, but not all documents were in open access. Some were closed, and only the revolution, only after Maidan, special decommunization laws were adopted by the Supreme Council of Ukraine, and according to this law, all archives of repressive authorities became open. So now it's very easy to find these files. You can just write a letter, even you can write a letter by email to the archive, SBU archive, and archivists can help you to find documents you need. And besides this, these archival documents are mainly in open access due to different programs. They are open, and it's very easy to communicate. It's really fascinating cooperation with SBU archivists in Ukraine, and they help online now during this COVID quarantine, and help in research, and help not only historians who are professional historians, but only common people who look for their relatives and try to discover the fates of their relatives, and many other things. Very useful.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And at the very end, you mentioned the fate of Kostya Shtepa, who reported extensively on Hrushevsky, but who ended up being arrested as well. Was this kind of fate common, typical for other informants? What do we know about other informants as well?
No, this fate was not typical. He was unique informant, and he was real agent, not informant. He was agent. Many of sexots whom I disclosed were shot in 1937, 1938, or died in labor camps. So their fates were very sad. Instead, they reported to the GPU. So these reports did not help them in surveillance, unfortunately.
And I just wanted to make one more comment based on your presentation. So in spite of the fact that the main focus was made on their professional activity, for example, or on those public spaces that they were in which they were functioning, the informants and the agents were establishing that surveillance not only on their professional activity, but on their public or on their private space as well, on their private lives as well. So that kind of system was establishing surveillance of both public and private life and shaping it in some way.
Yes, you're right, yes. And many reports were even only about private life and private contacts, not only about professional contacts. You're right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Oksana. Thank you so much for this fascinating topic. And I do hope that this information will be available in English or in German someday soon. Thank you for this wonderful presentation and for this talk that sheds light on how the Soviet system operated and how the Soviet system established this total control, total surveillance as well. Thank you so much, Oksana.
Thank you.
Thank you. Today, Oksana Yurkova presented her talk, Academic Januses, GPU-NKVD, Secret Informants at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, 1920s, 1930s. Thank you for attending our lecture today, and please join us next Tuesday. Information about upcoming events will be posted on the UkrSO listserv and on our Facebook page, Ukrainian Studies Organization at Indiana University. You can view previous lectures and talks on our YouTube channel for future events that we will post. Please subscribe to our channel.